Oh, that was the original front. That was front end. Should have had.
Right,
Huh?
yeah, right.
Wow.
It's close.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely isn't the car, but it's a good snapshot in time.
Yes.
Did you get
Right.
pictures on
I
it?
agree.
I'm gonna get a picture of yourself like that.
David, what's your input on all this?
So first I want to say that I didn't think I'd be the closer because I was supposed to be in the afternoon session. So here we are, Pat Murray and I are going to kind of close this thing off with a few stories about the Fiero's interior. But the passion you guys have, we keep talking about family and how people on the stage are family. You guys are family. And it was amazing to me. I was at the 35th. I got tracked down by Jeff Jones, who's out here, who somehow connected the tea leaves of the fact that on my LinkedIn I had Fiero, and I was friends with somebody that he knew that was on Fiero, and next thing I know, I'm sucked into this family. It's amazing, it really is. I tell everybody a job that I did 40 years ago was a job. I mean, that's what we did. We got paid to do our job. And to have you guys still passionate about what we did 40 years ago is absolutely stunning and amazing. My name's David Emerling, and I was on the interior of GM back in the early part of my career. And I started my career testing the Fiero before it even came into production. And Greg Peterson, who was on the earlier panel, you'll see some pictures. He and I worked together. He was the development engineer, and I was the test engineer at the time. And Jim Shedlowski, who's in the audience here this morning, talked about special problems. I'm a graduate of special problems. I guess I got out of kindergarten, according to him. So this was my second job as a test engineer, and I did the HVAC, I did the radios, and I did the steering wheel. Then I got promoted to release engineer, and I did instrument clusters, steering wheels, and the center console pack, which we're going to talk about a little bit. But the most amazing part, which we've talked about briefly, but we're going to get into more detail, is the 89 Fiero, which is not a 90. It was the 89 Fiero, and I was the instrument cluster and the switch engineer. Bill Zuch, who was here earlier, was also on that. He was the IP guy, and he had to leave, so unfortunately. But that's me with the production Fiero in front of my house in Cleveland. I grew up in Ohio. And Bucks, all right. So the wild part.
He's here on a work visa.
Yeah. They're gonna send me home. So this does not look like a wild picture because it looks like a production Fiero in front of my house. That's my whole family. But what's wild about this picture is that Greg Peterson, who was the one that spoke this morning, or this afternoon, he and I were on our way to Lockport, New York to test the HVAC system on a hand-built prototype of the Fiero, which is the car in the picture. And it didn't have a VIN number, so there was no way we were going to go across the border to Canada to get it to Lockport, which was the fastest path. So we had to go through the States. To get through the States to Lockport, you have to go through Cleveland, which just happened to be my hometown. And I was a young engineer at the time, a couple of years out of college. I called all my friends and I said to Greg, I said, we gotta eat, let's go get a home cooked meal. So I showed up with that hand-built Fiero, and all my high school friends showed up, and my family was there, and that was everybody was pretty amazed by the car that was going to be coming out soon. So also talking about development. So again, these are hand-built prototypes. And believe it or not, it's Greg on the left in the yellow shirt, and me in, of course, Ohio State shirt. This was out west. We were testing hot weather. The Fiero. I want to point out in the circle, this was well before telematics and electronics and everything. The only way you knew if something was working or not working is because you had gauges on the hood. So that's pictures of that's on a West Coast trip. These next pictures are what we used to call pilot trips. So just before a car would go to the public, the first cars off the line went literally across the country and back, and it lasted about a month. And it used to be one or two of each model, but since the Fiero was a brand new release, we had a whole slew of them. So as you can see, there's car after car in the various lanes. But we stopped at this really cool old retro gas station that. And this again, it's 40 years ago, so it was old looking then. And we pulled into this gas station with all of these Fieros before they even were on the road, and we were swarmed by everybody. People were chasing us. There was a guy that literally went about 30 miles out of his way to just be with our caravan. But there's a bunch of test engineers. You can see them all meandering around the car, comparing the test data, and everything was written down by hand. There was no computers. And we always had what was called chase cars with us, because you never knew with these cars whether they were going to make it or not. So the station wagons there were the chase cars, and they were loaded with tools and spare parts and everything else. But this was at the side of the road before the car was sold, and this was us testing the cars. So we pulled into this other station, and everybody keeps talking about Porsche. So this was like a wild picture, because our white Fiero was right next to the white Porsche, and it was uncanny how unbelievable and how cool it was that we were going to be competing with that vehicle. Again, a lot of taking data, a lot of cool cars, a lot of pictures of the team going across the country. Fast forward to production. This is the plant before they shipped, and I was in product engineering. The plant was connected by a parking lot. So once we started making these things, it was kind of cool to go back and see the cars. My next section of my presentation is related to the '89 Fiero, and the only reason why I keep stressing the '89 is because for whatever reason your community thinks it's the '90. But this graphic will prove that it was the '89, and Pat Murray and I was part of the team. Pat was my stylist, I was a product engineer, and this was an actual sketch rendering of what that interior was going to look like. Pat's got some really cool glossies from the studio, but this was all the call-outs, and that interior was going to be awesome. Unfortunately, tomorrow's car that you're going to see does not have this interior, and I'll tell you a little bit about what the car tomorrow will have. This interior never, ever, ever, unfortunately, got built with anything other than a real crude mock-up that we did. Now, the story that's really wild about the '89 Fiero is that it was not designed here in the United States, or in Michigan. It was the middle of the 80s, this was 85, I believe, and there was a designer shortage, and the designers are the ones that did all the actual design of the product. We were the engineers that guided them. And some entrepreneurial guy had this great idea that if he opened up a design center in Tampa, Florida, that all the retirees from GM would flock to this facility. And he convinced the management that it was a great idea. So he opened up this design center. And unfortunately, Bill Zuch isn't here to tell the story, because I was trying to remember who, because we had to go down to Tampa literally. We started on a Monday on a plane, and we ended on Friday on a plane, and we were there every single week helping guide the designers. And I called up Bill Zuch just before this last week to see if he was coming to this event. I said, "Were you part of the Tampa Engineering Center down in Florida?" He says, "Let me tell you a story." He says, "I got down there and there was no furniture in the entire building." And I said, "What?" He goes, "Yeah." He said the owner said he was waiting for the first PO from GM, and he didn't get the PO, and we were all going to fly down, and there was nothing down there. So he said, I went on my corporate credit card, and I bought all the furniture, and I got all kinds of crap when I turned in my expense report, but he says that's how we got furniture down there. So we flew down there, and we pulled off the most unbelievable thing. Bill had a quote from Hulky from a magazine that said, how did he pull off what he's done over the years? He said, people just let me alone. The Tampa, Florida facility was unknown by any upper management. We just did our job, and we designed that entire interior, the entire car actually, in about 8-9 months, which was amazing, because no executives got down there to kind of fiddle and change and that's a true story. So yeah, the Tampa thing was pretty cool. So this is basically for my cluster. I was a cluster engineer. This was the level 2 spec that the platform would produce, and then I would produce the level 3 spec, which I have a copy of the document, and I gave it to Fred back in the day. This is the actual clay, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because Pat has much better pictures of it. This was the interior. But the interesting part about this is as we keep talking about the fact that this program got canceled, and somebody actually said this morning that parts of the Fiero live on past the Fiero. So what happened was I was the cluster engineer, and AC Delco, which turned into Delphi, as everybody knows, was the cluster of the production cluster. And I was also a cluster engineer on the Pontiac STE and the Pontiac A-Car. And it was the first cluster that GM sourced to a non-Delco supplier, and they actually sourced it to a Japanese company called Nippon Denso, who's now Denso, which is a ginormous company. AC Delco got so mad that they were going to lose this cluster for the 89 that they pulled out all the stops that they were going to prove that they were really just as good as a Japanese company. And I had what was called a product development team, which basically had the product engineers, the manufacturing people, and purchasing all together for like the first time. This was earth-shattering back in the day, but that's how we do business now. And one of the things we were doing is going around to all the suppliers that wanted to be sourced, and we were doing plant visits. We walk into the Flint plant that was building the current Fiero cluster for their plant visit, and they had a ginormous sign over the plant door that said, "Welcome Fiero team." Every single plant person was wearing Fiero t-shirts, and they were just so geeked that we were there, and they just completely blew us away. I mean, absolutely blew us away. So when we designed and built this cluster for the 89, we decided to eliminate the prototype tools and go straight to production. So for the prototype of the 89 Fiero, that was completely tooled and ready to go, and then the program got canceled. So what happened was they mocked up a concept car that kind of used my cluster with this glove box, which somebody in the audience actually has a prototype of this glove box that he worked at the shop that made that. But this is what was cobbled into the 89 Fiero concept car, and for whatever reason, Fred figured out a way to get one. And I still don't know how he has that car, but he has a car that has this interior in it that never made it to see the light. But the crazy part about this thing, and Pat's gonna talk more about this, is that cluster was production tooled, and it was really well received. Everybody loved it. So it ended up, and I'm gonna skip these renderings, it ended up in the current production, or the Firebird in Trans Am in 1980, 92 or 3. And that's the Fiero cluster. That's the 89 Fiero cluster. And of all crazy things, I was on the design team that did that car, and with that cluster in it. And Chevy, for the Camaro, had a completely different interior. Different cluster, everything's different. In 1997, for whatever reason, Chevy decided to use the Pontiac interior in the Camaro, and that cluster lived on in the Camaro too. And I hate to admit this, but I have 2 Camaros, and I was at the Camaro show last week, and I was going through the cars going, that's the Fiero cluster, that's the Fiero cluster, and everybody. So that's all I have to say. Pat's going to close with some really cool renderings of and stuff that's talking about how the studio supported us. And I have to tell you one story about Pat as I introduce him here. He was a young designer at the time. He's still a young designer. In fact, we were comparing notes. He started Pontiac Interior Studio in 1984, and he was the. We were trying to figure out what, because he didn't do the current Fiero, he only did the future Fiero, and he kept saying to me, the GT, what we did on the 89 ended up in the current production GT. And I said, that's not possible because we did the design in 85 and it wouldn't have crossed over. And I said, maybe you're thinking about the little gauge pack that went over the radio that this V6 has got because we ran out of gauge space in the current cluster. And he goes, that makes sense. That sounds like a rookie job for a styling person. So that was when we were trying to figure out what where he came in on the Fiero. But the one thing about Pat, as a young designer, as an engineer, most of the time, and no offense to your styling guys that are here, the engineers were told what it was going to look like, and we had to make it happen. And that was the rule. Don't tell me how to manufacture it. I don't care. Just this is the look. Make it happen. Pat was the first person that I ever worked at the studio that said, "How are you going to make this? Let's figure this out." So I was always impressed with that. And with that, I'm going to introduce Pat.
Well, there goes my reputation as an uncompromising designer. Well, because the fact is that I was not trained formally as a car designer. I was in art school, and I was setting up for my final thesis. I was setting up for a fine art competition in one half of the gallery. I actually graduated with Kirk Benyon, same year, and Kirk was in the other half of the gallery with all the car designer candidates. And the car companies came down to interview the car designer candidates. But I had a broken leg, a weasel on my shoulder, and I was hanging fine art. And well, I had a broken ankle. I was on crutches. I don't know how my weasel stayed on my shoulder. But John Chanella came walking across, and he's looking at my artwork. And there was a little sketchbook, and he's thumbing through the sketchbook, and I was actually headed for, if I didn't win the scholarship, I was going to be a furniture designer or a toy designer, some sort of product designer. And at the time, GM, they actually had a phenomenal staff perspective. So the exterior styling teams were mostly people who studied car design and wanted to be car designers their whole lives, and they bled diesel fuel, and it was like, but the interior designers were product designers. They were problem solvers, ergonomics, packaging. So they asked if I wanted to come up and test drive GM, and they would test drive me, and I told I was about to head to Mattel, and I said, I think I'm going to try this car thing for 6 months. And I tried it, and I don't know if it's because the roads suck and it's hard to get out of Detroit, but I haven't left. I moved into Pontiac, and then moved to Waterford, and I'm now about 2 miles south of here, so I can still hear the M1 concourse at night. And what I was blessed with being able to work in the Pontiac interior studio. So these are my friends from Pontiac at that time. And what was cool is that you were given the responsibility of a vehicle. So I was given the responsibility of the next generation Fiero, and the current generation Fiero was pretty awesome. The seat had, as you know, speakers in the headrest. So I took one, cut it off the car, mounted it to my office chair, and plugged it in my stereo, and I had a stereo in my studio car seat, which was very unique. There are people today still trying to reintroduce that, but with all the anti-whiplash head restraint crap, it's not quite as feasible. But everybody did everything. I learned from every one of my colleagues there. General Motors was incredible. Besides John Cafaro, John Albert, Kirk Benyon, the colleagues in the exterior studio that taught me the passion of automotive design. The clay modelers were all artists from art schools, from all walks of life. I remember at the time the wood shop were like all German craftsmen that they recruited from all over the place, and the metal workers were all phenomenal. And it wasn't union, non-union, it was everybody was gifted at what they did and the best in the world at what they did. That building, that dome, had more talent in it than I had ever seen in one building in my lifetime, still to this day, and I've done a lot since. So General Motors was a great fit for me, but I also was a very functionally driven designer, so working with engineers like Dave on the Fiero program and other projects, and Bill Such, as he mentioned earlier, there was an exodus from General Motors of the engineering talent out to the supply base. So I went with them. I went out to the supply base, learned a ton more, was able to expand my horizon as well as improve products in a tangible way. We could actually make products that worked and still have the passion for the art of design. The exterior clearly captures the customer, sells the car, but if the interior sucks, you're not going to sell another one, right? So the interior has to really work. Pontiac was unique in that they're very focused on the driver. It's a very driver-centric platform. At the time, the exterior teams were always talking about muscular, athletic, energetic, entertaining. So it was fun. The red reference that John Chanella offered earlier with regard to the instrumentation was directly from fighter planes. And it didn't make sense because most of the people that bought the vehicles were males, and most males are colorblind to the color of orange and red. We picked orange and red. And the 89 Fiero was going to have kind of an array of switches that surrounded the steering wheel so that you didn't have to take your hand off the wheel in order to slap on your headlights or etc. So all about driving, all about driver-centric. And the center stack in the original Fiero, as you know, it was a cluster center stack and then storage on the passenger side. And the storage on the passenger side was relatively woeful. It wasn't well received. They also Pontiac really wanted to sell to females. And women liked the Fiero, but there weren't enough women purchasing the Fiero, so we started to listen to why that was the case. So here you can see where everything is kind of driver bias. Even the window switches on the door are forced as far forward and high as possible. The switches go around the steering wheel, and then the center console is angled toward the driver, biased toward the driver. And these are, my apologies, I found these in my basement. I don't think these are gonna be gifted to yourself as well as the Pontiac Museum.
Yes.
Because I just found them, and so I had someone in the studio this morning scan them all. There's a lot more than this. You can see where the switches were all the same height, and we had discussion in the studio about prioritizing, so the larger switches are the more frequently used, the medium-sized switches, the secondary, and then the tertiary are the smallest. And then we started to introduce the specific textures for grip, as well as you can see the contour on the backside because you push them on and pull them off. So it was a very tactile experience. And the mock-ups that we did in the studio, these are all clay models, every one of these photos. Dave was encouraging me to give you a little more insight on how we use clay. The clay is really all of the main surfaces that are on the model, and you'll see some of them are in their natural clay color. But then the artisans in our paint shop would paint with something they called, it was a brilliantly named product, it's called peel-off. Kind of like rice peel-off, but they spray it, and then we put a texture on, and then they spray the color, and when the review's over, you peel everything off with tape, and you start over. Or make the changes that management requires you to make. Right, Mr. Shinola?
Great looking interior, boss.
Well,
I never saw this before. Didn't know they were doing it.
we didn't invite you.
But we invited you guys.
No, I actually found a lot of pictures of the exterior studio reviews, and you always had interior images there. So we do have exterior images in the background, but this particular model made it because Chuck Jordan, who was our supreme leader at the time, he came in for, Chuck was the one who really promoted, I think, John, if it wasn't Chuck, who promoted the non-automotive people coming in to work in the interior studios. But he was really uncomfortable in interior reviews because he's all about passion. And I mean, you hear these gentlemen talk, that was Chuck. And if he would say, well, why don't you do this? Because it would be so cool and it would look, and you say, well, Chuck, because no one could reach it because it's too far away. And he'd be like, oh, well, okay. So the ergonomics, the physicality of an interior really drives the design. We strive to have the passion that the exterior has, but you have to meet the ergonomic requirements of the occupant. So we had a review with Chuck one day on a Saturday, and it was with a clay model just like this. And he came in with his brother. He had two brothers, I don't remember which it was, but his brother came in and he was like, I'm gonna show my brother what I do for a living. And his brother sat in the passenger seat, he sat in the driver's seat. And the review was going okay, but I was really nervous because this is like my interior and the big boss and his brother's there, and if his brother doesn't like something. So his brother gets out of the passenger side at the end of the review, and everything looks real because it's painted and grained, and he slams the door. And the clay door falls off onto the passenger seat, and he's like, oh shit. And Chuck gets out and he gently closes the driver's door and he said, good review. Okay. And no changes. He never came back and he never brought his brother.
You're reminding me of a story. This one right here. You see the steering, I told you I was a steering wheel engineer. see this picture with the droop of the 4-spoke. How many of you guys out there have the 3-spoke sport wheel in your Fiero? Quite a few. So the way that the design went is these guys would style it up, and then we would design it, and then the tooling guy would come in with what we call the die model, and that's what they were going to actually cast the urethane tools off of. And they brought in the die model for me to sign off on it to go into production. And I grabbed the 3-spoke, and you see how it almost looks like the thumbs belong right in the crux of the wheel. I put my fingers in that, and it hurt. There was like a ridge on it that was like hard and angular. And I said to the guy, I said, "This can't go into production. This hurts my thumbs." So he says, "What do you want to do?" So we went down to the shop, I got a file out, and I kept filing until my thumbs felt good on it. And if you guys think the thumbs feel good, then you can thank me, but if you think it sucks, don't talk to me.
I mean, at the time, Pontiac, we really were searching for ergonomic improvements at every level, and the snake that swallowed the rat was something that we talked a lot about, and this swell in the steering wheel right here, because when your thumbs hang, that's one position, but that's not the driving position. It's grabbing those rats that is the driving position. So it might have been the vehicle you were talking about, Kurt, that was like what happened to. There was a $1 million engine in a Pontiac that had one of our prototype steering wheels, and it had these really aggressive. I mean, this snake swallowed a big rat, and there was this really aggressive steering wheel, and it was parked in front of Arthur Pride's house one night in Southfield, and it was stolen. And it was like, holy crap, this $1 million car was stolen. They found it the next morning. It was up on blocks. The wheels were gone. Good wheel design. And the steering wheel was gone. But the engine, untouched. So, good wheel design.
Thank you.
It was stolen. So a lot of different levels throughout the design process. And the other thing that was unique about Pontiac is that we had our own interior trim design person in the studio, which is all the fabrics and all the textures that go within the vehicle. We were responsible for the sound of the turn indicator, the sound of the warning systems. I mean, everything about Pontiac, which was what was cool about this city, is that, I mean, I had Pontiac engineers show up at my house, and it's like, I have an idea, and we go in the garage, and we bang it out. I think John referred to that earlier. It didn't matter whether you were in a shop out in the city or whether you were in the studio. This stuff happened like everywhere in the community, which was very cool about being in Pontiac and being in the area at the time. And there still is a lot of that going on. A lot happens in the shops in the city, not just in the studios, in the OEMs. And then there's the details, and I wanted to kind of end with this because there's a lot of things that go into the design process that we don't explain to people because we expect you to experience them. We call them Easter eggs, right? You find it and you go, wow, you know, after you buy the vehicle 2 months later. We did a lot of ergonomic embellishment on the underside of the door panel door pull. And you don't see it when you're sitting in the vehicle, but on the underside of the door pull, you have just a subtle, you know, this is yours, this fits your hand. Same thing with the steering wheels. We talked about women drivers earlier. One of the things that young ladies are concerned about, especially with a two-seater, is where do you put your purse? And you put your purse in the passenger seat, or you put it on the floor and you slam on the brakes, it's not reachable. You put it on the passenger seat where it's reachable and someone can snatch and grab it. So we put a blank slide on the screen. We put a little hook where you could put your purse on the passenger seat or on the center console and hook the strap so that if someone tries to grab it, it's secured. Just small things to try to make it more convenient and comfortable. The current Fiero, the original Fiero, I should say, really had a woeful storage on the passenger side. So this is its own clay model. It ended here, and the whole clay model existed just to explore how big could we really make a latchable, lockable storage. So the clay model had a functional, physical, and that's all hand modeled by clay. And boy, I beg customers today to use clay because the physicality of an interior matters, because at the end of the day, you're selling a physical product. We're not Hollywood selling movies, we're selling physical products. And this was an example of where we were able to maximize the stowage space by demonstrating what that can mean early on in the studio.
Bill Zuch told me earlier, go back to that one, that the design of this was pretty amazing, because the whole bin itself was molded right into the IP, so it wasn't a separate. If you notice, most glove boxes today is a separate insert, but he had this designed right into the tool of the IP. Working with Pat, who wanted to know how everything went together.
Yeah, and originally, since the air ducts were integrated into the instrument panel and the air duct, the outboard duct was here, this was going to be an air-conditioned glove box. So you could, like if you're diabetic, you could keep your insulin in there. Or if you like to dye the chocolates, you could dye.
And he actually told me that story too. And he said that it was pretty cool because they thought that for no extra cost they could make this, like you said, but legal says, oh no, people would put beer in it, so we can't sell it like that. Always those lawyers.
So what's wrong with having beer in your car that's cold? So we actually did something like this. So I was at General Motors for 15 years, and then I left for a supplier because a lot of the engineers were leaving for suppliers, and the suppliers were actually being given interior design responsibility. So I left for Lear Corporation, and we did a heated and cooled center console for Volvo, and it was a huge success, and no one ever used it for beer. So I'm going to end on this. This is something that as a problem solver designer that I was describing myself as earlier, I really struggle with air registers being not very good. Like at the time, they were either barrels, and when you rotated the barrel, you were actually shutting off airflow. You were adjusting the air up and down, but you were shutting off airflow. So we tried this early on, and it was cool looking and interesting, but it didn't work terribly well. And then there was this little side air outlet that got me to thinking if, and this was my first GM patent. This was such an interesting moment because GM at the time, when you got a patent, they gave you, what was it, a silver dollar or something wonderful like that. And then if it actually became a patent, you got a plaque, which was cool. But they owned the patent. My name's on it, but they owned it. And it was a patent for an air register where you could take one chiclet and use it to articulate the horizontal or the vertical vanes, just one chiclet. And I thought it never made it to production because the Fiero was canceled, and I was really bummed. However, It made it to production. I got my silver dollar. And today, that concept that General Motors owns is in most vehicles in the world. And I'm fantasizing because this is, you know, like Pontiac. So I'm fantasizing. 70 million vehicles sold per year globally. If half, and I know today that more than half have this air vane in it. And I know because at Lear I was responsible for intellectual property. I know that each vehicle has 4 vents in the front, some of them have 2 in the rear. We'll just say 4 per vehicle. And we had to pay $1 for each patent we infringed, and we got $1 for each patent infringement against us. So I'm taking $1 for each patent infringement instance, 4 per vehicle. 35 million vehicles, which is a conservative estimate of half, times 4 per vehicle is $140 million per year. Between 2022 and 1989, 33 years times $140 million, $4,620,000. That's a mic drop.
So we keep talking about family. I feel like the band has gotten together. This has been phenomenal to have two speaking panels today, all day. We haven't been together like this ever, and I thank both Jen and Fred for really letting us do this because this has been a joy. It really has. Thanks.
Ted, you sit up here all night and you've been speechless. Have you been all talked out? Getting past your bedtime?
No, I'm gonna stick with their
So, I want to talk about John Callies. He and I were the motorsports guys, but I just supported him, and he was the guy. Chevy would have had a dozen people, and not got a quarter of what he got done. He knew everybody in the industry. He knew the racers. He went to every race. I bet you he didn't have 10 days off one year in 82, 83. He was the best vehicle engineer and engine engineer all rolled into one, and then he knew everybody in the aftermarket. On top of that, and we were just so blessed to have him be one of ours at Pontiac. So John, you deserve that and more. And by the way, in his youth, he was a real fireball. He was. Oh, geez. He's a hard guy to run with. But I just wanted to mention that. John, you don't get all the credit you deserve.
We kind of idolize you guys, and what's really neat is earlier in the presentation, you had mentioned how you looked at the cars that are all at the hotel and everything, and you had mentioned the chop tops. And you guys were the innovators to start. With the mention of chop tops, I have to introduce somebody that's very special to us. Mr. V8 Archie, he's in the audience right here. Stand up, Archie. That is the man who introduced us to the Chop Top Fiero. Do you need a mic? He's one of our heroes. He brought us the Chop Top Fiero, and they're very popular. And the V8s, yes, we know him as V8 Archie. And he was the first ones to start putting in the V8s and the Fieros clear back in the 80s. So here's to you, Archie. Thank you for coming. Kirk, did you have enough to say tonight? You're great. All right. Well, that kind of concludes our guest speakers. Jen has a few words to say.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I wanted to especially thank Fiero John of John Miller Car Care for being one of our sponsors for this event, along with his club, Mid-Atlantic Fiero Owners Association. And I also want to give a special shout out to David Emerling, because David's become one of us. I realized that last week when he sent someone an email and he said, we are planning an event and we'd like you to be involved in our event. So David, thank you. You were an instrumental player along with several other individuals in this room in getting these guys here tonight. We're so grateful for your support, and one of these days we might get you in a Fiero. Thanks everybody. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Have a good and safe ride home.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. See everybody tomorrow.
So
Should be, what, right here?
oh, you want to hear? Okay, sure. There you go, brother.
Thank you so much. You bet. About 60 of these. Huh?